The stars spilled across the viewport like a frozen ocean, their pale light glinting off the hull of the ardent Venture. Commander Elias Mercer stood with his hands clasped behind his back, shoulders squared in a posture that was more habit than pride. Out here, on the bleeding edge of explored space, discipline was the only armor against the creeping silence. His crew was small, barely 50 men and women, but every one of them carried the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes, for humanity's colonies relied on these survey runs to push the frontier forward. Dr. Lyra Vance broke the hush with the rustle of her data slate, her voice quick with the crisp efficiency of someone who rarely hesitated. "Commander, I've isolated the signal again. It's not a natural emission, definitely artificial, structured, but distorted." Her dark hair fell loose from its tie, and she absently tucked it back as though the motion might help her think clearer. Mercer tilted his head toward the console, where her analysis bloomed in layered spectrograms. Jagged spikes of sound, stretched thin, pulsed across the display like a dying heartbeat. "Range," he asked. 45,000 kilometers. Origin point. Unknown vessel. Adrift. The pattern repeats every 90 seconds. Mercer's jaw tightened. Out here, they weren't supposed to find much beyond rocks, gas, and the occasional barren world. A derelict was trouble. Trouble meant risk. And yet, that small flicker of curiosity, a trait humanity had never managed to kill, sparked behind his eyes. "Bring us within visual range." Cautiously, the ardent Venture slid forward on muted thrusters, engines whispering against the void. Crew at their stations watched as a shape emerged from the dark, first as a silhouette, then as a hulking form fractured by damage. It was no design Mercer recognized. Angular plates, curved spines of metal protruding like the bones of some mechanical leviathan. Hull breaches gaped wide, edges frozen and scorched. No transponder signal answered their hails. "Not human," Lyra murmured. There was awe there, but also dread. "Commander!" "This is first contact." The words hung heavy. First contact was supposed to be orchestrated by ambassadors and committees, not stumbled upon by a mid-range survey vessel. Mercer knew the procedures. Report contain, wait. But staring at the crippled vessel, he also saw smoke-like trails escaping the ruptured sections and flashes that might have been movement. Survivors, perhaps minutes from death. Launch a boarding team. Mercer ordered before doubt could root itself. Minimal arms, full suits. "Dr. Vance, you're with me?" Lyra's lips parted, caught between protest and exhilaration, but she gathered her gear without question. The boarding craft detached with shudder and drifted across the gulf. As they approached, Mercer glimpsed more detail. Glyphs etched across the hull in long spirals, delicate ridges worn smooth as if the ship itself had weathered centuries. The docking was rough, magnetic clamps hissing as they sealed against a jagged tear. Inside, the alien vessel breathed cold. Lights flickered in ghostly hues of violet and silver, shadows stretching across corridors that curved in disorienting arcs. Air was thin but present, metallic, tinged with something floral and acrid. Mercer's helmet filtered it down to data, oxygen-compatible, though barely. Figures stirred in the gloom. They were taller than humans, limbs slender as reeds, skin translucent enough to reveal a faint shimmer of vessels beneath. Eyes like molten amber fixed on the intruders with a fragile terror of cornered prey. They spoke in tones like wind through chimes, incomprehensible. Lyra stepped forward, lifting her hands in a universal gesture of peace. Her voice trembled but held steady. "We're here to help. Can you understand me?" The nearest alien tilted its head, then coughed, a sound too brittle for a creature that elegant. One collapsed, body convulsing with weakness. Mercer dropped to a knee, checking vitals despite having no frame of reference. "They're dying," he muttered. "Radiation poisoning, maybe. Or starvation," Lyra finished, scanning with her slate. "Nutritional markers are depleted. They've been drifting too long." One alien rasped a sound, then traced something with trembling fingers against the deck. Shapes, jagged spirals repeating like the glyphs outside. A warning, maybe. Lyra's eyes widened as translation algorithms flickered. They're saying fleeing, pursued, consumed. Mercer's throat tightened. He knew what desperation sounded like. no matter the tongue. The survivors were running from something vast enough to break them, advanced enough to rip apart their ship. And now, humanity was on its trail. "Commander," Lyra whispered, "if they're right, whatever did this might still be nearby." He felt the crew waiting on his word, both in the shuttle and back on the Ardent Venture. Retreat would be safest. Cut losses. Vanish into the dark. But the image of those frail bodies, bones showing beneath translucent skin, clawed at him. Humanity had clawed its way out of extinction too many times to ignore suffering. Mercer rose, meeting the wide, fearful eyes of the alien before him. "We're not leaving you here," he said, voice resolute though he knew they could not understand. Then to his crew, "Get them aboard. Fast." As the boarding team hurried to carry the fragile survivors, a low tremor quivered through the alien hull, faint but unmistakable, like the rumble of distant thunder in a dead sky. The survivors whimpered, clutching at their rescuers, amber eyes brimming with fresh terror. Lyra shot Mercer a look that needed no words. The enemy was real, and they had just painted humanity into its shadow. The shuttle detached with its cargo of the fragile and the unknown, pulling free from the broken ship. Through the viewport, Mercer watched the alien vessel drift, a carcass adrift in an endless ocean. He thought of the shapes the alien had traced, the word Lyra had translated. Consumed. Something was out there, vast enough to drive civilizations to ruin. And now, with the weight of frightened eyes on his crew, Elias Mercer felt the first threads of a responsibility that reached far beyond Earth. The stars had never felt closer or more dangerous. This is Section 1. 1,000 words introduces Elias Mercer, Dr. Lyra Vance, the alien survivors, and the central conflict, humanity's chance encounter with a fleeing, fragile race pursued by an unseen enemy. Would you like me to carry the tone and pacing of this section forward into Section 2, the rising conflict? Or do you want it to shift into something more action-heavy as humanity begins proving its edge? The infirmary of the Ardent Venture had never felt so small. The alien survivors lay stretched across hastily modified bunks, their frames too long and fragile for human standards. Translucent skin shimmered faintly beneath medical lights, revealing bones so fine they seemed made of glass. Dr. Lyra Vance moved between them with a measured calm that belied the storm behind her eyes, adjusting nutrient drips and recalibrating the ship's med scanners to read what they barely understood. Commander Elias Mercer watched in the doorway, arms folded tight across his chest, unwilling to step closer for fear of crowding the space. One of the aliens stirred, amber eyes flickering open. Its voice rang like brittle glass tapped by a hesitant hand, weak yet insistent. Lyra angled her slate toward the sound, the translation software clawing at fragments. At last a phrase emerged, halting but clear enough. "The swarm follows." Mercer exhaled sharply, a habit that betrayed the tension he kept hidden from his crew. "Swarm. That's the word they used before, isn't it?" Lyra nodded, grim. "Yes. Fleeing. Consumed. Now swarm. It's consistent." She lowered her voice, though the survivors were too weak to understand. "If they're right, Commander, their predator might already be tracking us." The hum of the ship filled the silence that followed, each vibration magnified by the thought of unseen eyes beyond the stars. Hours later, the bridge carried a weight far heavier than its modest size could hold. Lieutenant Harrow at sensors stiffened in his chair, voice clipped, picking up a faint signature, vectoring in from the debris field. Patterns irregular. No transponder, no comms. Mercer moved to his station in a single stride. Range. 70,000 clicks and closing fast. "Sir, it's not like anything I've ever seen. Fractured readings, multiple returns. It's almost like a swarm," Mercer finished. His tone was iron, but his eyes flashed toward Lyra, who had joined him on the bridge, pale beneath the glow of the consoles. The alien survivors were too weak to speak, but their terror had already etched itself into the marrow of the crew. Even those without words felt it, some primal dread that hummed through survivors' bodies when the unknown drew near. Mercer straightened, his voice steady as it rolled across the bridge. "Battle stations. Bring weapons online." The Ardent Venture was a survey vessel, not a warship. Its arsenal was meant for defense, deterrence, never prolonged engagement. Yet the crew moved with sharp precision, fingers flying across panels, eyes narrowing as adrenaline cut through doubt. The first glimpse of their pursuers hit the viewport like a wound. Fragments of metal, dozens of them, moved with a dreadful harmony, each shard bristling with spines and motes of light that flickered like malignant stars. The swarm was not a fleet in the way humans or even the survivors might imagine. It was a living storm of machines, twisting and shifting, unbound by formation or fear. "They're scanning us," Harrow murmured, sweat beating his temple. "Multiple frequencies, invasive sweeps. Sir, it's like they're tasting us." Lyra's hands gripped the rail, knuckles pale. No wonder the survivors are terrified. Against that, even an empire would fracture. Mercer forced a knot in his chest down where it belonged. Fear could wait. Orders could not. Plot an intercept course toward the nearest asteroid cluster. If they want a taste, let's see how they like a chase. The crew obeyed, the ship jolting into sudden acceleration. The swarm followed, tendrils of light flickering across the void, reshaping their path to mirror the human vessel. Mercer leaned into tension, eyes fixed forward, mind already turning over possibilities. A survey ship could not win by strength, but unpredictability was another matter. Humanity's greatest weapon had always been audacity. As they approached the asteroid field, Mercer snapped, "Engines to maximum thrust. Thread us through the densest cluster you can manage." The ship plunged into a labyrinth of rock and shadow. Alarms howled as proximity warnings lit up the bridge, but the crew pressed on, hands steady despite the chaos. Behind them, the swarm surged without hesitation, shards weaving between tumbling stones, relentless and unerring. "Arm railguns," Mercer ordered. "Target the largest asteroid ahead. On my mark, fire, then detonate the charge as we pass." The Ardent Venture's hull rattled as its weapons thundered, slamming into the heart of a massive rock. As they shot past, the asteroid fractured, shards colliding with the swarm. Explosions flared, fragments scattering into darkness. The bridge erupted with cheers that faltered almost instantly as the swarm reformed, coalescing again, diminished but unbroken. "They adapt," Lyra whispered, horror tightening her words. Even debris doesn't slow them for long. Mercer's gaze swept the crew, reading the fear in their faces. This was what the survivors had fled, an enemy that could not be bargained with, that fed on weakness and erased the concept of retreat. And yet, in that hopelessness, he found his resolve sharpen. "We're not outpacing them," he said firmly, "but unpredictability confuses them. They didn't expect us to use the field as a weapon. That means they don't think the way we do." He leaned closer to the helm. "Set a course for the derelict's remains. We'll use the wreckage." Gasps rippled across the bridge. To run back into the carcass of the alien ship was madness, a trap of their own making. But Mercer's eyes held no doubt. Madness was often the shape of survival. The Ardent Venture swung back, engines howling as they tore toward the graveyard of twisted alien steel. The swarm followed, stretching into elongated lines of light, like claws outstretched. As they neared the drifting hulk, Mercer gave the order, "Release fuel pods. Ignite them the moment the swarm closes." The pods tumbled free, floating like forgotten cargo. When the swarm surged through, a spark from the Ardent Venture's weapons kissed the vapor. Fire blossomed in the vacuum, brief and brilliant, tearing through the vanguard of the machines. Shards exploded, fragments scattering into silence. The bridge shook with the force of the blast. But this time the silence that followed carried something new, a hesitation. The swarm faltered, its fractured remains knitting back together slower, less certain. "They didn't expect that," Lyra breathed, wonder flickering in her eyes for the first time. "They can't predict us." Mercer finally allowed himself a thin, grim smile. "Good. Then we've got an edge." Humanity's greatest trick is doing what no one sane would dare. The swarm did not retreat, but it lingered at distance, shifting like a wounded predator uncertain of its prey. For the first time since their arrival, the crew of the Ardent Venture felt space enough to breathe. Yet beneath the relief lingered the truth. This battle was only a test. The enemy had seen them, and next time it would come prepared. This is Section 2. 1,000 words. The alien swarm is revealed. Humanity's unpredictability gives them a fleeting advantage, and the conflict escalates into an inevitable larger confrontation. Do you want Section 3 to lean heavily into large-scale space combat, or shift focus to ground-level human resilience and sacrifice as the climax? The ardent venture drifted in uneasy silence, its hull scarred, its crew hollow-eyed from the hours of tension. The swarm lingered at distance, watching with a patience that felt inhuman. Commander Elias Mercer stood at the viewport, hands braced against the cold railing, eyes fixed on the shifting fragments that moved like a storm on the horizon. They had bloodied the machine tide, but only barely. He could sense it testing them, cataloging their tactics, preparing to return with a cruelty that would not forgive. Dr. Lyra Vance entered quietly, exhaustion etched into her features, yet her posture still taut with resolve. "The survivors are stabilizing," she said, voice low. "They'll live, at least for now. But they know what's coming. Even without words, their fear is unmistakable." Mercer nodded but did not turn. "Fear's a luxury we can't afford. If the swarm follows us back to human space, every colony, every station we've built will burn. We end here or we run forever." Lyra stepped closer, searching his face. "End it? Commander, we don't have the firepower. This ship isn't a warship. Humanity isn't even aware of this enemy." Finally, Mercer turned to her, and though fatigue shadowed his eyes, the fire beneath was steady. "Then we'll show the galaxy something the swarm doesn't understand. What humans do when cornered." The plan he laid out in the hours that followed felt less like strategy and more like defiance woven into steel. They would draw the swarm into the gravity well of the system's dying star. The ardent venture would play bait, threading the dangerous orbit where tidal forces could crush even hardened hulls. If the swarm followed, the humans would detonate the alien wreckage they had salvaged, its fuel and core reactors converted into a bomb vast enough to trigger a stellar flare. It was reckless, desperate, but it was also something the swarm could not anticipate. The crew listened, and though fear gnawed at them, none faltered. Humanity had always survived by gambling everything on impossible odds. When the hour arrived, the ardent venture descended into the abyss of the star's gravity. The viewport was filled with fire, waves of solar plasma curling like the arms of a sleeping giant. The ship groaned as though in protest, every rivet straining against forces no vessel was meant to endure. The swarm followed, shards flickering against the star's glare, a predator scenting its kill. "Pods armed," Lieutenant Harrow reported, sweat tracing lines down his temple. "Fuel rigs are in position." Mercer's voice cut like a blade to the thick air. "Hold until they're fully inside. We only get one chance." Lyra clutched the console beside him, her knuckles white. "If this fails—" "It won't," Mercer interrupted, eyes locked on the enemy. His tone was absolute, though deep within he knew he was making a promise no one could guarantee. The swarm surged closer, fragments shifting into new formations, testing the ship's defenses with probing strikes. Sparks danced across the hull as energy beams grazed their shields, warning of the annihilation that would follow if they lingered too long. "Now!" Mercer ordered. The pods ignited. Fuel and reactor cores detonated in a chain of blinding light, rippling outward. For a breathless instant, the void itself seemed to flare alive. The shockwave cascaded into the star's surface, destabilizing it, coaxing from a burst of fury that had slumbered for millennia. A solar flare erupted, a wall of incandescent fire racing outward. The swarm had no time to adapt. Its fragments twisted, scattering, but the tide was faster. Waves of plasma engulfed them, vaporizing metal, shattering cohesion. For the first time, the predator screamed, not in sound, but in the sudden absence of its dreadful presence. The ardent venture was caught at the edge of the blast, shields straining, systems failing one by one. Consoles flickered, alarms screamed, and the ship tumbled as if tossed by an unseen hand. Mercer held fast, forcing his voice steady. "Ride it out. Keep her together." The ship groaned like a wounded beast, but did not break. At last, the flare subsided, leaving only drifting fragments where the swarm had once gathered. Silence filled the bridge, broken only by the ragged breaths of those who had lived through the impossible. Cheers threatened to rise, but Mercer stilled them with a raised hand. Don't celebrate yet. We won a battle, not the war. If these things are what drove the survivors to the edge of extinction, then there are more, many more. Lyra leaned against the railing, sweat darkening her collar, eyes fixed on the emptiness ahead. But we prove they can bleed, that they can be stopped. Mercer allowed himself a rare smile, small but fierce, and that humanity won't run. Not now, not ever. Behind them, the survivors stirred in their beds, their amber eyes watching the humans with something new, something more than gratitude. Reverence, perhaps, for a species so fragile. Humans had shown a resilience that even the stars could not extinguish. The ardent venture, battered but unbroken, turned from the dying star. Ahead lay the vastness of unknown space, filled with enemies unseen and challenges unmeasured. But within its scar hull, a truth had taken root. Humanity's recklessness, its defiance, its refusal to yield, was not a weakness. It was a weapon, and somewhere in the endless dark, other eyes would learn to fear it. This is Section 3. 1,000 words humanity's desperate gamble against the swarm culminates in a victory that proves their defiance is their greatest strength, while foreshadowing a much larger war still to come. Would you like me to now stitch all 3 sections together into one seamless 5,000-word manuscript with refined transitions, or keep them as distinct chapters for easier editing? The ardent venture limped through the quiet corridors of space, its hull patched with temporary seals, its engines laboring with every burn. Though the swarm had been scattered in the blaze of the star, the silence that followed carried no comfort. Commander Elias Mercer felt the weight of it as he stood on the bridge, staring into the dark, where every shadow seemed to suggest a remnant waiting to reform. Victory was a fragile word, and he refused to let his crew mistake survival for triumph. Dr. Lyra Vance drifted onto the bridge, a faint weariness behind her determined expression. She held her slate against her chest like a shield. "The survivors are regaining strength," she reported. "They're beginning to communicate more, though it's fragmentary. Their language adapts awkwardly to translation. But one thing is clear. The swarm is only one piece of a larger threat. They call it a consuming tide." Mercer turned at that, studying her face as though the phrase itself might be carved there. "A tide doesn't end with one wave." "No," she said, her voice steady but taut. "And what we destroyed was only a ripple." Silence settled between them. Outside the viewport, the alien survivors' ship fragments still drifted like bones in a cosmic graveyard, a reminder of how swiftly empires could be broken. Humanity had tested itself against the tide and endured, but endurance was not victory. Lieutenant Harrow interrupted with grim urgency. "Commander, long-range sensors are detecting faint signatures at the system's edge. Multiple contacts. They're not moving directly toward us yet, but the pattern matches the swarm's fragments. They're gathering." The bridge froze. No one breathed. Mercer stepped closer to the console, eyes narrowing at the indistinct shapes forming on the display. There was time, but not much, and with every hour that passed, the tide drew closer. "We can't fight them alone," Lyra whispered. The words were quiet, but every officer heard them, and the truth cut sharp. Mercer clenched his fist behind his back. He had always believed in the strength of his crew, in humanity's resilience. But here at the edge of extinction, pride had no place. "Then we'll need allies," he said at last. Lyra looked toward the infirmary, where their fragile passengers lay. "They've seen the swarm longer than we have. Their people fought and lost. But they might know more than they can tell us now. If we can bridge the gap, then we might know how to stop it," Mercer finished, his voice a softened a fraction, though steel lingered beneath. "And if we can't, then at least we'll warn the colonies. Humanity won't be blindsided." The decision took root in him then, solid as bedrock. Their mission had changed. They were no longer explorers, no longer mere survivors. They were messengers carrying the warning of a storm no one else yet believed existed. Hours bled into days as the ship limped away from the dying star, each moment a test of endurance. The alien survivors grew stronger, though their bodies remained fragile, their amber eyes haunted by memories that could not yet be spoken. Lyra worked tirelessly with them, her voice patient, her gestures careful, building a bridge of trust one phrase at a time. On the bridge, Mercer kept vigil. The swarm lingered at the system's edge, never advancing, never retreating, like a predator shadowing its prey. It was as if the machine studied them, curious to see where humanity would run. That patience terrified him more than an immediate attack, for it meant the enemy was learning. Late in the ship's cycle, when most of the crew slept, Lyra found Mercer still at his post. The stars glowed faintly, distant and cold. She set her slate aside and stood beside him, letting the silence stretch before speaking. "You carry it all too heavily," she said. He did not look at her. "It's my burden." "No," she said softly. "It's ours. You can't hold the tide back alone." Her words lingered, and for a moment, the mask he wore cracked. He allowed himself a breath, deep and unguarded, before the steel closed in again. "Then help me carry it," he said. She smiled faintly, the weariness in her face tempered by resolve. "Always." The moment passed, but something unspoken bound him more firmly than before. Command was still his, but the weight of the tide was no longer his alone. When the next day came, Harrow delivered news with eyes wide. "Commander, the survivors, they've given us coordinates, a place they call a sanctuary. If their translation is right, it's where their people last gathered before the tide broke them." Mercer studied the data. The coordinates pointed far beyond the frontier, deeper into the dark than any human vessel had charted. It was a gamble, a leap into the unknown, but the decision was already clear. "Set course," he ordered. "If there's knowledge left, we'll find it. If there are allies, we'll need them." The ship turned from its lonely vigil at the system's edge, engines burning weak but steady. Behind them, the swarm shifted, fragments dispersing into patterns too complex to decipher. Mercer felt the weight of their gaze, even as the stars swallowed the distance. The tide had not ended. It was only beginning, and humanity, fragile and reckless, had stepped onto a stage vast enough to drown worlds. This is Section 4, 1,000 words. It sets the stage for the broader war, deepens the relationship between Mercer and Lyra, reveals the swarm is larger than imagined, and closes with promise of journeying toward potential allies while the enemy watches. Would you like me to expand this into a continuing saga outline, Sections 5 to 8, so the arc feels like a full novel, or keep it tightly wrapped as a novella-style story with a strong cliffhanger?